The blizzard had come without warning, sweeping down from the Bitterroot Mountains with a fury that turned day into night. 48-year-old Emmett Blackwood watched it from his cabin window, the wooden shutters rattling against the howling wind. He'd seen storms like this before, brutal, unforgiving tempests that swallowed men whole and left nothing but bones come spring thaw. 20 years in these mountains had taught him to respect such power. His weathered face, lined with the stories of countless winters, remained impassive as he stoked the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across the walls of his solitary home, built by his own hands after the war. Those same hands now reached for his pipe, packed it methodically with tobacco, and lit it with a burning twig. Outside, the world had disappeared behind a curtain of white. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to know what city you're watching from. Emmett had not expected visitors. He never did. The nearest settlement, Redemption Creek, lay 20 miles east through the mountain pass, and few had reason to venture this deep into the wilderness, especially as winter tightened its grip on the territory. His nearest neighbor, if one could call him that, was old Jim Turnbull, whose cabin stood 3 miles south along Blackwater Ridge. They exchanged supplies once a month and otherwise kept to themselves, an arrangement that suited both men just fine. Emmett's solitude had been hard-won after the horrors he'd witnessed at Shiloh and Antietam. The mountains had offered him peace when the nightmares of blue and gray uniforms, soaked in blood, became too much to bear. He'd traded the chaos of civilization for the honest brutality of nature, finding a strange comfort in its indifference to human suffering. The sound came suddenly, faint but distinct against the storm's wail. Emmett set down his pipe, his body tensing like a wolf scenting prey. Years of survival in the wilderness had sharpened his senses beyond those of ordinary men. He listened again, holding his breath as the wind momentarily died down. There it was, a human cry, carried on the edge of the gale. Someone was out there. Someone was dying. With practiced efficiency, he reached for his heavy bearskin coat, pulled on fur-lined gloves, and wrapped a thick wool scarf around his neck and lower face. His Winchester rifle remained on its pegs above the door. Whatever was out there needed saving, not shooting. Instead, he grabbed a storm lantern, shielding the precious flame as he pushed open the cabin door. The cold hit him like a physical blow, the wind driving needles of ice against any exposed skin. Visibility extended barely beyond arm's reach, the storm lantern's glow creating a small, pathetic sphere of light against the whiteout conditions. Emmett secured a guide rope around his waist, the other end tied firmly to his porch post. Men had frozen to death just feet from their own doorways in storms like this, disoriented by the blinding snow. He plunged forward, calling out in a voice that was immediately torn away by the wind. The snowdrifts reached past his knees in places, each step requiring deliberate effort. He followed the sound, trusting his instincts more than his senses as the blizzard worked to confuse both. After what seemed an eternity, but couldn't have been more than 15 minutes, Emmett's lantern illuminated a dark shape half buried in the snow. His heart quickened as he pushed forward with renewed urgency. It was a woman, collapsed face down in a drift, a carpetbag nearby, suggesting she'd been traveling. Her clothes, though quality, were woefully inadequate for the mountain conditions. A city woman, lost and dying in a world she didn't understand. Kneeling beside her, he rolled her gently onto her back, brushing snow from her face. She was young, perhaps 30, with features that might have been handsome in better circumstances. Now they were blue-tinged and slack with cold. Pressing his fingers to her neck, He detected a pulse, faint, fluttering like a wounded bird, but present. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. She managed a weak moan that was barely audible over the storm's rage. There was no time for questions or explanations. Emmett gathered her limp form into his arms, noting with concern how little she weighed, how the cold had already worked deep into her bones. Following his guide rope back through the blizzard, he clutched her against his chest, using his own body as a shield against the elements. "You'll breathe because I do," he vowed, the words emerging as steam in the frozen air. "I didn't survive Shiloh to let a woman die on my mountain." Whether she heard him or not didn't matter. It was a promise to himself as much as to her. One more soul he wouldn't fail to save. The warmth of the cabin hit them like a physical wave as Emmett shouldered the door open, careful not to bang the woman's head against the frame. The fire had burned down somewhat during his absence, and he kicked it back to life with his boot, while still cradling her in his arms. Laying her gently on his bed, rough-hewn but comfortable with a bare skin and wool blankets, he set to work with practiced efficiency. Her clothes were soaked through, the expensive fabric now a deadly liability as it leached warmth from her body. Propriety be damned, she would die unless he acted quickly. With a hunter's knife, he cut away her frozen dress and petticoats, averting his eyes as much as possible, while still ensuring he removed everything wet. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, placing hot stones from the hearth at her feet and beside her body. Her face remained pale as death, lips tinged an alarming blue. Emmett knew from experience that warming her external limbs wasn't enough. Her core temperature needed to rise, or she would slip away despite his efforts. He'd seen it during the war. Soldiers rescued from icy rivers who seemed to be recovering only to fade as their hearts gave out from the cold that had settled deep in their chests. With grim determination, he shed his own outer layers and slipped under the blankets beside her, pulling her rigid body against his chest. It was survival, plain and simple. Body heat was the most reliable way to combat severe cold, and he'd be damned if he'd let modesty kill this woman after he'd gone to such lengths to save her. "Fight," he whispered into her hair, which smelled faintly of lavender beneath the scent of snow and pine. "Fight for your life, ma'am. Dawn's coming, and you'll see it." Hours passed as the blizzard continued its assault on the cabin, rattling windows and howling down the chimney like a beast denied its prey. Emmett remained vigilant, checking the woman's pulse and breathing at regular intervals, forcing sips of warm broth between her lips when possible. Slowly, incrementally, color began returning to her cheeks. Her breathing deepened, becoming less shallow and desperate. Around midnight, her eyes fluttered open, deep brown irises clouded with confusion and fear. "Where?" She managed, her voice a hoarse whisper. Emmett quickly explained the situation in simple terms, maintaining a respectful distance now that she was conscious. Her name, she told him with considerable effort, was Elizabeth Chambers. She had been on the stage to Redemption Creek when the weather turned. The driver had tried to push through rather than turn back, and the stage had overturned in a drift. She had struck out alone, seeking help or shelter. "Fool thing to do," Emmett commented, though not unkindly. He'd seen many die from such desperate decisions. The others? Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears she seemed too exhausted to shed. She didn't know, hadn't seen them after wandering away. The information sat heavily in Emmett's chest. If there were others from the stagecoach still alive out there, But no. The storm was peaking now, and venturing out would only create more victims. At dawn, if the weather broke, he would search. For now, his responsibility lay with the woman Providence had placed in his care. "Rest," he told her, his tone gentler than it had been in years. "You're safe now. We'll figure the rest out when you're stronger." She nodded weakly and closed her eyes, slipping back into sleep. Emmett settled into his chair by the fire, rifle across his lap, a habit from too many years alone in wilderness that didn't forgive mistakes. Morning brought merciful quiet as the storm spent its fury and moved eastward. Wan sunlight filtered through frost-covered windows, illuminating Elizabeth's sleeping form. She looked better, still pale, but no longer at death's door. Emmett had spent the night alternating between dozing in his chair and checking on his unexpected guest. Now he built up the fire and put coffee on to boil, the familiar ritual centering him as he considered the complications this woman brought to his carefully ordered existence. He was frying bacon when she stirred, pushing herself up on one elbow and taking in her surroundings with greater clarity than the night before. Their eyes met across the small cabin, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of the gravity of what had transpired. "Thank you," she said simply. 2 words that acknowledged both her salvation and his role in it. As Elizabeth recovered her strength over the following days, Emmett learned her story in pieces, each revelation filling out the picture of this woman who had literally blown into his life. She was a school teacher, hired by the town council of Redemption Creek to establish proper education for the growing settlement's children. A widow, her husband a Union captain, had survived the war, only to succumb to typhoid 3 years later. She had come west, seeking purpose and distance from painful memories, not unlike Emmett himself. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them, though they spoke around it rather than addressing it directly. When she was well enough to sit at his rough-hewn table, wrapped in one of his flannel shirts that swallowed her slender frame, they shared meals and halting conversation. Emmett found himself speaking more in those days than he had in the past year combined. The discovery that there had been others in the stagecoach weighed heavily on Emmett. As soon as the weather permitted, he set out to search, following Elizabeth's vague directions to where the accident had occurred. What he found confirmed his grim expectations. The driver and the one other passenger, a drummer selling patent medicines, had succumbed to the cold. He buried them properly, marking the graves with stones, and brought back Elizabeth's trunk, which had remained strapped to the overturned coach. The news hit her hard, though she bore it with a quiet dignity that impressed him. That evening, he found her weeping silently by the fire, her grief private yet palpable in the small cabin. Emmett gave her space, retreating to the lean-to where he kept his tools and worked on minor repairs until she had composed herself. Some burdens couldn't be shared, he knew, only carried until their weight became bearable. As Elizabeth's health improved and the worst of winter's grip loosened, they established an unexpected routine. She insisted on contributing to the household work, learning to cook on a wood stove and helping with indoor tasks while still regaining her full strength. Emmett found himself making small improvements to the cabin that he'd put off for years, patching the roof more thoroughly, crafting a second chair for the table, fashioning crude but functional shelves where Elizabeth arranged her few salvaged books. They read together in the evenings, her voice bringing life to pages he'd never bothered to open before. She didn't press him about his past, and he extended the same courtesy to her, but through proximity and shared labor, their stories emerged in fragments, forming a mosaic of understanding. The question of what would happen when the mountain pass cleared enough for travel hung between them, unspoken but ever-present. Emmett knew Elizabeth had obligations in Redemption Creek, a contract, expectations, a life she had committed to before fate intervened. He had no right to ask her to abandon those responsibilities, nor any reason to believe she would consider doing so. Yet the thought of returning to his solitary existence after these weeks of shared companionship settled like a stone in his stomach. He found himself making excuses for why the pass remained impassable, even as signs of early spring began appearing on the lower slopes. Elizabeth, for her part, spoke of her teaching position with enthusiasm that seemed to dim slightly when the subject of leaving arose. Neither acknowledged the tension building as the inevitable parted them. The decision was forced upon them when Jeb Turner, a trapper heading to town for supplies, stopped by the cabin and offered to escort Elizabeth to Redemption Creek. The trail was difficult but manageable now, he reported, and would only improve in the coming weeks. Emmett watched her face as she processed this information, noting the conflict that briefly clouded her features before she composed herself and thanked Jeb for his kindness. That evening, as she packed her few belongings, the cabin seemed smaller and more confining than it ever had before. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough," Elizabeth said, folding one of his shirts she had been using and placing it neatly on the bed. Emmett grunted in response, unable to articulate the thoughts tumbling through his mind. He'd survived nearly 20 years in these mountains by keeping his needs simple and his attachments few. One woman shouldn't have the power to unravel that carefully constructed piece. Yet, as he watched her preparations, Emmett felt something shifting within him, continental plates grinding against one another, creating pressure that demanded release. "You don't have to go tomorrow," he said finally, the words rough-edged and unpracticed. "The town's waited this long. Another week won't matter." Elizabeth paused in her folding, her back to him, as she considered his words and what lay beneath them. When she turned, her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes held questions he wasn't sure how to answer. "The children need education, Mr. Blackwood. I made a commitment." There was a firmness in her voice that he respected, even as it frustrated him. She wouldn't be swayed by half measures or implied sentiments. If he wanted her to stay, truly stay, he would need to offer more than a temporary delay. The morning of her departure dawned clear and cold. The kind of crystalline mountain day that revealed every peak and valley in sharp relief. Emmett had barely slept, his mind churning with possibilities and their consequences. He'd lived so long with only his own counsel that the prospect of making room for another's thoughts and needs seemed simultaneously terrifying and essential. Elizabeth moved about the cabin with practiced familiarity, preparing a final breakfast for them both. Her movements efficient, yet somehow reluctant. When Jeb arrived, earlier than expected, the moment of decision crystallized with startling clarity. Emmett stepped outside with the trapper, while Elizabeth gathered her things, ostensibly to discuss the trail conditions, but actually to propose something altogether different. By the time they re-entered the cabin, an agreement had been reached that would change the course of 3 lives. "Miss Chambers," Emmett began, the formality sounding strange after their weeks of proximity. "I've asked Jeb to carry a message to the town council." Elizabeth looked up from her packing, confusion evident in her expression. "A message?" Emmett nodded, struggling to find words that had rusted from disuse. "Proposing that the school term begin a month later than planned to account for circumstances." He paused, gathering courage that had never failed him against bear or mountain lion, but wavered now before this slip of a woman, and suggesting that the teacher might benefit from local knowledge before taking up her post, that a guide familiar with the territory could assist in her preparation. Understanding dawned slowly in Elizabeth's eyes, followed by a wariness he couldn't blame her for. "And what does this guide propose exactly?" "That you stay," Emmett said simply, laying bare the heart of the matter. "Not as my guest or my burden, as my partner, if you'll have me." The words hung in the cabin's still air, transforming the space between them into something fraught with possibility. "I'm not a gentleman, Elizabeth. The mountains have stripped away whatever softness I might have once possessed. But that night in the blizzard, I made you a vow. You breathe because I do. It meant something more than just that moment, I think." He gestured around the cabin, to the small improvements they had made together. "This place has been shelter, not home, until you were in it. I don't ask you to abandon your teaching. Just consider making your base here instead of town quarters. I could take you in when weather permits." Elizabeth stood very still, her hands clasped before her, as she weighed his words and the life they offered. It wasn't a traditional proposal, but then, nothing about their meeting or circumstances had followed convention. "You should know," she said finally, "that I came west to stand on my own, not to replace one dependency with another." Emmett nodded, respecting the steel in her spine that had helped her survive both grief and the brutal storm. "I'm not offering rescue, Elizabeth. I'm offering partnership. These mountains respect strength and honesty above all. I've seen both in you." He stepped closer, but carefully maintained a respectful distance. "Take time to consider if you need it. Jeb can still take you to town today, but know that if you choose to stay, it would be as my equal, not my responsibility." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into infinity. The only sounds, the crackling fire, and their measured breathing. Finally, Elizabeth moved, not toward the door and waiting Jeb, but to the window that faced the mountains. "I've never seen such beauty as these peaks," she said softly. "Even when they nearly killed me, I couldn't hate them. There's an honesty in their brutality that's absent in civilization's polite cruelties." She turned back to face him, her decision visible in the set of her shoulders and the clarity of her gaze. "I'll stay, Emmett. Not forever. Not without seeing if this partnership can work. But I'll stay through spring, and we'll talk to the town council together about arrangements for the school." The relief that flooded through him was so profound that Emmett had to brace himself against the table. He'd faced down blizzards and grizzlies with less trepidation than he'd felt awaiting her answer. Jeb departed alone, carrying letters explaining the situation to the town council. As the sound of his horse's hooves faded down the mountain trail, Emmett and Elizabeth stood together in the doorway of the cabin that had transformed from his sanctuary to their possibility. The mountains stretched before them, peaks still snow-covered and gleaming in the morning light. "They'll talk," Elizabeth said pragmatically, "about a respectable woman living unmarried with a mountain man." Emmett nodded, having already considered this. "We'll marry if and when you're ready, not because they demand it." He glanced down at her, this woman who had collapsed in a storm and risen again through sheer force of will. The mountains don't care for society's rules, only for truth and survival. Elizabeth's hand found his, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who had been at death's door mere weeks ago. "Truth and survival," she repeated, "a solid foundation." As spring bloomed across the mountainside, Emmett and Elizabeth forged something neither had expected to find in the wilderness, a connection that honored both their need for independence and their desire for companionship. They established a routine that played to their respective strengths, Emmett teaching Elizabeth the practical skills of mountain survival, from tracking game to predicting weather from cloud patterns. Elizabeth introducing Emmett to books he'd never considered and perspectives beyond his experience. They made weekly trips into Redemption Creek once the trails cleared completely, Elizabeth holding informal classes for the town's children, while arrangements were made for a proper schoolhouse that would open in autumn. The town's initial suspicion of their arrangement gradually gave way to acceptance as they witnessed the positive changes in the formerly reclusive mountain man and recognized the intelligence and capability of their new teacher. One evening, in late spring, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant peaks in shades of gold and purple, Elizabeth broached a subject that had remained largely unspoken between them. "When you found me in that blizzard," she said quietly, "you made a vow. You'll breathe because I do." I've wondered many times what prompted such words from a man who had chosen solitude above all else. Emmett was silent for a long moment, his weathered hands still on the arm of his chair. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories long buried, but never forgotten. "During the war, at Antietam, I held a young private as he died. Couldn't have been more than 17. He asked me to breathe with him, to help him find the rhythm again. I did, until he couldn't any longer. After that, I think something in me stopped breathing fully too." Elizabeth reached across the space between their chairs and laid her hand gently on his arm, offering comfort without words. Emmett covered her hand with his own, the calluses of his palm rough against her skin. "When I found you in the snow," he continued, "it was like being offered a chance to do better, to not fail this time." He turned to meet her gaze directly, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "I didn't expect what came after. Didn't expect to start breathing again myself." The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than any physical touch they had shared. Elizabeth's eyes shone with unshed tears, not of pity, but of profound understanding. "Perhaps," she said softly, "we saved each other." Emmett nodded, words unnecessary as the truth of her statements settled around them, like a blanket against the gathering evening chill. The schoolhouse was completed by September, a simple but solid structure on the edge of Redemption Creek. As promised, Emmett had helped design an arrangement that allowed Elizabeth to fulfill her teaching obligations while maintaining their life together on the mountain. 3 days a week, she taught in town, staying in small but comfortable quarters behind the schoolhouse. The remaining time, she returned to their shared cabin, which had expanded over the summer to include a small study filled with books ordered from Denver and St. Louis. The town had adjusted to their unconventional arrangement, particularly after they made their partnership official in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher during his August visit. It wasn't the life either had envisioned when they came to this rugged territory, but it was one they had built together, breath by breath, day by day. On the anniversary of the blizzard that had brought them together, Emmett took Elizabeth to a ridge overlooking the spot where he had found her half buried in snow. The landscape looked entirely different under clear autumn skies, golden aspen leaves quaking in the gentle breeze, where once a whiteout had erased all landmarks. They stood in companionable silence, acknowledging the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I never thanked you properly," Elizabeth said at length, her hand finding his with the easy familiarity they now shared, "for saving my life that night." Emmett shook his head, squeezing her fingers gently. "No need," he replied, his voice still gruff, but warmed by the year they had spent together. "We keep each other breathing now." As if to demonstrate, he took a deep, deliberate breath, filling his lungs with the crisp mountain air. Elizabeth matched him, their chests rising and falling in unison as they gazed out over the wilderness that had nearly claimed her life, but had instead given them both a second chance at living.